Good evening. I am Gail Brewer, and I am the council member for the Upper West Side, and I cannot thank you enough for joining us here tonight. I am beyond delighted to partner with the American LGBTQ plus Museum. I love this museum. To host a panel called Queering the Fandom, Xenia and Beyond. This panel, which is amazing, will explore queer representation in media through time, building community, and accessing queer material. The discussion is happening, as you all know, alongside a difficult period where so many established rights are under assault in a way they have not been for a long time. And just like everyone on the panel tonight, I'm very concerned about the state of our country. Some, not all, some elected and appointed officials, you know which ones, throughout our nation are advancing policies that are harmful and hostile toward the LGBTQ community. Of course, they're hostile towards so many of us, but particularly this community. So many of these policies harm young people, like banning trans youth from playing sports, removing bullying protections for students, refusing to provide government funding for LGBT plus supportive services, and goodness knows book bans and more. In so many places, it is still difficult for young people to find a community where they feel they belong. And we must do a whole lot more to protect queer and trans youth. And I always call out Al Forney, True Colors, Hedrick Martin, Harvey Milk School for young people. And of course, I do love SAGE for us older adults. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Uvasi Bad, who recently passed. She lived on the Upper West Side, the district that I represent, and was a trailblazing advocate and attorney who influenced positive change for so many. Uvasi was a board member of the American LGBTQ plus Museum, and she quoted the museum. She said such positive things about this wonderful institution, quote, LGBTQ history is especially urgent because our communities have emerged from denial, repression, and invisibility into acceptance, pride, and full of societal participation. This museum helps forge the future by documenting our past, unquote. Stonewall Inn just placed her name alongside 4 other icons on their wall of heroes, and with good reason, so deserved. Uvasi was an important part of a larger movement that seeks to advance the rights of some while making sure that no one is left behind. She was known for that. We must hold her memory close and keep in mind the many brave Americans who came before us, many of whom were New Yorkers and fought valiantly to secure basic human rights for so many. I want to extend again a congratulations to everyone who is making this museum possible. And obviously tonight is an example of the incredible talent that surrounds everyone affiliated with this museum. I was pleased in the recent budget to put in some funding, and I know that there will be more in the future. I want to thank Lucy, who's a staff member for the museum, for leading the effort to put this event together. And now, without further ado, I want to turn the program over to Afroditi to make sure that it is moderated fabulously and that it is a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much this means to me to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Councilmember Gale. Really appreciate having you here. And on behalf of the American LGBTQ plus Museum, welcome to tonight's special virtual panel, Queering the Fandom, Xena and Beyond. I'm Aphrodite. I'm part cosplay, part drag, and full Gaijin fangirl. You can see me here today in my favorite cosplay, my Asami Sato look. And I've got a screenshot here from the series finale for those of you who are in the Avatar fandom. Yeah. So I use she, her pronouns, and I will be your moderator for this evening's conversation. We're very excited to invite 4 panelists who bring with them a range of experiences and contributions to queer history, fandom, and community. Gabrielle Zilka is an award-winning independent film director and the creator behind Queering the Script, the 2019 feature documentary about LGBTQ plus representation in the media in the context of Klexicon, a fan convention for LGBTQ women and allies. If you haven't seen this film, it's absolutely terrific. You need to watch it yesterday. One of my absolute favorites. And if you're a queer nerd and a fangirl, you're going to really appreciate the footage that's in that film. Penny Kavanaugh is the founder and CEO of Spark Purple, a company that delivers large group themed retreats for queer adults. Her original event, Xenite Retreat, many of the members of our audience today are Xenite retreaters, it is a Xena Warrior Princess themed summer camp where over 300 people from around the world have gathered to celebrate their passion. She is currently developing additional retreats centered around the two things she is most passionate about, fandom and the LGBTQ plus community. Sheila Briggs is an associate professor of religion and gender and sexuality studies at the University of Southern California, where she teaches a course on religion and popular culture. She's a fan of Xena Warrior Princess and has published on this TV show, including papers titled Elect Xena God. Why not, right? Religion remixed in a post-television culture in small screen and big picture television and lived religion. S.C. Lucier is a Stage Directors and Choreographers Society theater director and the writing genius behind Xena Warrior Musical at Lucier and Rose. Don't shake your head, it was genius. Lucy has had an eclectic career in live events, exhibits, and performance. They are working to bring queer, non-normative characters and underrepresented communities to the musical stage. And their latest project, Atalanta, The Long Shot, aims to do just that. So welcome to our special guests at today's panel. And I'm thrilled to be in the company of such terrific creators and contributors to our queer fandom community. Yes, y'all got many skills, as Xena would say. So to get us warmed up, I would love for our audience to learn a little bit more about each of you panelists. So in fandom circles, we talk about origin stories, right? That's the backstory that explains why a character becomes the protagonist in their story. Now, in queer life, our origin story is often discussed as our root, or the moment we knew we were different, the moment we knew we were queer and we became the protagonist of our queer stories, right? So we're talking about a defining moment or experience that leads you to understand yourself as being somehow different and as having a certain identity. So this is my icebreaker question for each of our panelists, just to get stuff started. When did you first realize you were a fan? Whether that's a queer fan or just a fan in general, at what point did being a fan start to feel central to who you are in some way? We want to know, what is your queer fandom origin story? And I'm gonna, if someone doesn't have one, I'm gonna just put a name out there. But anything coming to mind?
I mean, I'll always be the first to start talking.
Fabulous.
As you were asking that question, I was thinking, like, gosh, what was my really, really original origin? Like, what was it that kicked it all off? And I have to say, I think if it wasn't Sabrina the Teenage Witch, where everyone was going crazy over Harvey and I just wanted to stare at Melissa Joan Hart all day, or Buffy, where everyone was all about Angel and I was like, it was all about Faith and Buffy. But I think going back just a touch further, the Australian Gladiators. I was obsessed with Delta and Cheetah and just like running around, just wanting to just have I was completely obsessed, and my walls were covered in posters. And I know that that's what most kids do, but it was very clear when I walked into my friends' bedrooms and they were covered in boys' posters like Brad Pitt and all that. And it was like Drew Barrymore, Sarah Michelle Gellar in like a wet shower type of thing. I mean, it was very, very gay. Yes. And the Spice Girls, I think, was really when I kicked it up a notch into like absolute like fandom. And I really, like, if I didn't have merch, I couldn't really go out and buy all that much. You know, it was very expensive. I would just make my own. I would buy magazines and cut stuff up, and like I would buy white water bottles and then paste pictures of the Spice Girls on top of my water bottles, and just make my own merch. I was definitely at school known as like that girl that likes that Xena show. It was very gay.
Love that. I also love that DIYing your merch was part of that development process for you too?
One of my first pieces of Xena Warrior Princess merch was actually a bunch of shells and sand that I smuggled back over from New Zealand. Shh, don't tell customs. And I like glued it to a board, and I wrote Bethel's Beach and like made a little diorama of shells and sand from the Xena beach.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah, I definitely identify with making your own merch or being that weird girl in school who has, you know, something pasted, a bunch of pictures kind of collaged all over all of your school things, just to make it really clear that, you know, this is what you wanted to stare at all the time. For me though, Xena actually was my queer fandom moment. I don't know if I was really too much of a fan before that time, except for maybe in musical theater, which makes sense now because I live in the space between those two things. I was very obsessed with musical theater and was one of those annoying musical theater kids that would turn everything into song, and just generally people did not want to be around that. But I think Xena was the thing that I really felt like I entered that world, and it was there for me in a way that I really needed and gave me that kind of escape that I needed, which is also, I feel like, a really important part of queer fandom specifically, when you experience that kind of liberation from your life and you are able to feel supported and really immerse yourself in a world that can provide all the things that you feel like you don't have at that moment. So for me, that was definitely Xena. Yeah.
Yeah. A terrific place to start if you're going to be a fan of something.
Definitely.
My experience is very similar to Lucy's. I was not a fan really of anything before Xena. And for most of my adult life, before Xena, I had not had a television. I only got a television in 1993, like I was nearly 40 by the time I got a TV. And part of what had prompted me to do that was I'd been back in England on a sabbatical for a year, and I noticed that, you know, there were a lot of queer themed things or queer characters beginning to come up in TV shows, and including a few of color. And that sort of made me aware that that was out there. I'd also become a fan in England or in some senses. I began watching Star Trek, so I'll get a television. One of the problems I found when I got my American television that I'd sort of been aware first, that LGBT was totally absent. And so on New Year's Day, 1997, I went with a group of other people who also study the ancient world. We went on a hike up in the mountains in California, and everybody was talking about this show, Xena Warrior Princess. I said, what's that? They said, you aren't watching that? This is fantastic. I mean, this is so feminist. And there was also some, at that point, it was before like the subtext really became very visible and out there in the show, but it definitely was a feminist show at that point. And so I began watching halfway through the second season. And that is the season, that the time in the show that the subtext really became very visible. And for the first time, I became a fan of the show. It was something that I just didn't look at the first time it was shown that week. I would actually look at the repeat as well. So yeah, so Xena was my entry into fandom.
Yeah, I love that you came into this fandom when you were like in your 40s, in the 1990s, and you'd never really attached to something before this incredible, groundbreaking show. Thank you. Gabrielle, we haven't heard your story, your origin story.
Well, I realized I was different, not related to fandom at a very young age. That's even before I knew I was queer. But all that aside, Truthfully, I never really identified as a fan, and I think that's why I'm like almost afraid to out myself here. But fandom was not something I really felt. I have a bit of like a complex where I go in the opposite of where there's a lot of people. Like I'm like, if there's too many people there, that means that I need to take the devil's advocate position. But then through this, the process of making Queering the Script, I realized that I do as a fan. And it was of Drew Barrymore. And it's the closest thing that I can come to as a fandom, because she truly does have like communities of people who are like really obsessed with her in a way that goes beyond just like your average like celebrity kind of attachment or awe. And I realized that because through the film, I recognized some of the components of like, this person helped you realize something about yourself, whether it's your sexuality or whether it's your, you know, your resilience or your, you know, that there's a way out of something hard. I think, you know, they hold a piece of your identity that really that you project onto them. And I think that that's exactly what I did. And I also got all the posters. I also got all the books. I even got the Playboy, and I was, so if that's not a fan, my friends, I don't know what is.
Oh, I love that. You know, I think it's really exciting to hear that, because I mean, I think across fandoms, you know, actors or specific people attached to to media become much larger than themselves because of how they help us heal or grow or evolve as people. So thank you for sharing those stories with us. So for the conversation, I want to rewind back, and let's start with some, you know, fandom history. So queer fandom really came of age as the internet became more widely used in the 1990s. It's really hard to separate the internet from fandom, and it's really hard to separate queer fandom from the internet, right? So in the 1990s, as people were, you know, starting to use AOL and get online and find things online related to their interests, queer fans were talking to each other on message boards for the first time. Yes, Yahoo groups, thank you, exactly. Maybe they were lurking in the Xena message boards like I was. I never posted, but I read everybody's stuff. You know, and people were also sharing their interpretations of things that they were seeing on the screen, right? And of course, they're writing and sharing fan fiction during this time. And then in 1997, the very first official XenaCon takes place. So before this, maybe there hadn't been like a large mass gathering of queer fans in the US context, but many queer fans had been talking to each other online. So XenaCon takes place in 1997, and the show kind of becomes this hit. Since we have some longtime Xenites on the panel, we want to know from you, like, can you tell us what it was like in the early days? How were queer fans of Xena engaging with fandom and with each other at that time? Penny.
Sheila, were you on those boards, Sheila? Because I was a Xena fan right up until the point where Gabrielle cut her hair, and then I was like, fuck this, I'm out. And I left, and I, sorry, but I was really, really mad when Gabrielle cut all her hair off. So I pieced out of the fandom for a bit. And then also, to be fair, it was the censorship in Australia that caused some issues for me to watch it. And so I didn't rediscover Xena until like the 2000s back after it had been off air. So I wasn't around for like the, you know, the Yahoo groups, the Merpups, all of that. I was on a website called Safe Searching, which was actually, I don't know if anybody knows what Safe Searching is because it was like really old school, but it was Alyssa Milano and her mother who had this like website message boards where you could go and like have a wholesome gathering and like chat about fandom, but we made it so gay. We like took over the Buffy board and the Charmed board, and it was very, very queer and amazing. Like fanfic and like role playing was so much fun, but it wasn't like role playing is now. It was literally like it would go over spans of months, and there would be posts and like your little signatures that showed you like who you were into at the time. And I don't know, but I can't speak for Xena.
Yeah.
I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah, I'd like to stress what Aphrodite said. the Xena fandom emerged just at that point when the internet was not just taking off, but it was actually reaching, beyond the techie, beyond the nerds who knew how to do all this complicated stuff that you had to do on message boards. This was the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web really transformed our fandom because it meant that fandoms which had already had an impetus at the start of the internet on message boards, that they became much more accessible to people who themselves might not be able to create a web page, but could look at it. And I think that what is really critical in the history of Xena fandom is the creation of Whoosh by Kim Tabor. Yeah. And if you want to know the history of Xena, we have this marvelous archive of Whoosh, which Kim has preserved. She's currently writing about it and its place within the fandom of the time. And what she's writing about now, looking back, is that she created this Xena nonfiction site, but it was part of this broader ecosystem. And I'm sure we're going to get on to talking about fan fiction at some point, because I think it was fan fiction that not only cemented the queerness of the Xena show, but also, and this is a point Kim Tabor is making in what she's writing, it actually transformed lesbian fiction. And one of the remarkable things about the show is that you got one of these, the most famous of these fan writers, Missy Good actually wrote 2 episodes for the last season. So you have what begins on the internet as a response to the TV show, actually moving along with the queer subtext, actually into getting more and more embedded in the television show itself. And that is really remarkable. And there was nothing else like it at the time. So yeah, other shows were also discovering the internet, but Xena Royal Princess had a particular place in the internet, in that it really bridged TV and internet. It brought creators and fans together in ways that were not usual at that time, and which I think the studios had a lot of problems with.
I think that's why we're here 27 years later, because the timing was so perfect that it created this just explosion of magic that kind of froze in time, but also grew and then changed. And yeah, Xena has a lot to answer for in fandom and the internet.
I think also with subtext, sometimes if you're questioning your sexuality, or you don't have someone who's watching the show to talk about the show with, you might gaslight yourself and think, oh, that didn't really happen. Or, I was imagining it, it's just my wishful thinking and not something that's actually happening on the screen. Or maybe I'm interpreting this the wrong way. But once you're able to go online and see people in these forums talk about it and write about it, you're like, oh, wait, I'm not alone. And I am not completely cuckoo for having this read on what's happening between the characters as well. So it can be a kind of validating and affirming thing to find people online who are watching the same thing you saw and confirming what it is that you're suspecting is taking place, especially when it's subtext and not necessarily main text yet.
Heck yeah. And it adds to the layers as well. Like you're watching a show, you're feeling something, you go out, you read something about it, and all of a sudden there's backstory to this character that isn't canon, but it's still backstory because it's really, really good writing. And then you decide you want to start writing something, and then someone else gets inspired from you. And all of a sudden there's entire libraries of fan fiction. And then the showrunners start paying attention to the fans and bring fans on to write for the show. And then there's a whole, what was there, I can't remember how many seasons of virtual series once the show ended. Fans got together and said, we're not done with this, let's write our own series. And so they continued it, and it went on from there. It's amazing.
Now, Sheila, as the academic on our panel, it would be great to hearing you talk with such excitement about like the sort of the larger social implications of Xena. It would be really great to hear from you. A show like Xena, people who maybe aren't serious fans, they think, oh, this is like a campy action adventure dramedy filled with all these anachronisms. It's kind of silly. There's queer subtext and maybe there's main text. Why is a show like Xena worthy of analysis, worthy of serious analysis and scholarly analysis here? Because I think for shows like Xena or even shows like Buffy, they're so campy that they're kind of relegated to the trivial in mainstream society. Why is something like Xena like relevant for academic study?
It has taken a long time for popular culture, in particular television, to really make it into mainstream academia. It's really only happened in the last 15 years that television has become like respected as an object of study in mainstream academia. But again, I mean, Xena plays a role in this, and Whoosh plays a role in this, because Whoosh was created by Kim Taborn, who is an escaped academic. And so she set it up, and so it was part satirical academic journal, but it was also had articles written by real academics. And so it sort of created this public intellectual space where you could take it seriously, intellectually seriously. And that in the long run had an impact on what happens in mainstream academia. I don't think that there are really so many other, at this time, I think this is the first. I mean, there have been imitations and of what happened in the Xena fandom, but I don't think that there's any fandom which has had such an impact on its own study. I think that's, and then Whoosh plays a significant part in it. There's not quite nothing quite analogous to Whoosh, because it's online, it's accessible to anybody can publish in it. Yes, there's a whole cottage industry on Star Trek, and before Xena, there was a whole cottage industry in Star Trek, but that was books, and it's religion and Star Trek, physics and Star Trek. But it didn't sort of lead, because I think it came from an earlier period, to that same sort of public intellectual ferment that you found on Whoosh, and that had such, I think, an impact on how one thinks about the academic study of television.
So can you say more about your academic writings on pop culture and on television? What can we learn about queer studies and gender studies through the study of pop culture and television?
Well, my first interest in the show was that it was feminist. and that it was this feminist retelling of history. And back in the 90s, this was very important. Women, queer or straight, were still struggling to get their stories heard and to get that into the mainstream. In gender and sexuality studies departments, there's always been an interest in popular culture. I think at least in any of the scholars under 70. Okay, the first generation sometimes found it a little strange, but we used to have, my university, we used to have faculty retreats, and this was in the gender studies department. This was when the women in my School of Religion department met, and like we would all talk about what popular culture we were looking at, because it was in popular culture that often the questions which were being raised by feminist historians of whatever were actually getting aired. And back in, used to be like 2000, my colleague Amy Richlin, who is a classicist, a feminism and classics conference, which was held at USC, and we invited R.J. Stewart to come, and we had a whole session on Xena. So yeah, feminism has always seen, except in the, at least from like the 80s and particularly from the 90s onwards, has always looked for this connection to popular culture. But it's been difficult to get that into the mainstream, and to some extent, getting popular culture and particularly television into the mainstream of academia has mirrored the success of gender and sexuality studies, of making it into the mainstream and seen as being part of the core of academia.
It's interesting. I think back on, how did a girl on the playground told me to watch a show called Xena because it shows girls kicking butt, and that's all I wanted to see as a little girl, right? On some level that there's something wrong with patriarchy, even if you don't have the language, even if you're not an academic, even if you're not in gender or sexuality studies or in feminist studies, even if you don't know what feminism is, something is wrong. And you see a show like Xena as a kind of antidote to that. And then you're like, this is my access point. This is my touch point. I have to watch this every week. Yeah. So
yeah. Especially because Xena is it's almost above the law. I think that's the part that really alleviated any kind of anxiety I had about my relationship to society and community, is because if you notice, like, Xena can always get out of the situation or do the right thing without repercussion and kind of like lead the way in making that happen and taking action. So yes, absolutely to that comment.
And also in the show, all the men are pretty stupid. They're kind of ugly and stupid. All these villains, they're like, and they look really, they're to be laughed at. And I think that was a kind of way like, oh, we're in on this joke. Like we see what is happening here, and that's how it's resonating for us. So thinking about like XenaCon, which, had its heyday in the 90s, and then things started to change, right? So Xena ended like 2001, the L Word had its premiere a few years after that. And then, and then we see sort of queers engaging with, like, I guess a more mainstream, it was on Showtime, mainstream TV show, but right, in the 2000s. And then we kind of like cut to Plexicon, which came a bit later. So we've had like some sort of eras of major kind of like major television series or shows where you're seeing like queer fandom, and specifically queer women and LGBTQ women and allies kind of converge in this space. Now, Gabrielle, you are like, you said so yourself, you came at this as a bit of an outsider, which makes you a great sort of documentarian. And can you tell us about why you felt it was important to document, mass fandom gatherings like Klexicon in your film, and more generally, what drew you to queer fandom throughout history as a film subject?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So I think I'll start kind of with the reverse. The story of coming to Queer the Script originally was supposed to be about something else, specifically about Carmilla, which is a web series that exploded into fandom. Like, I can't tell you, being in Canada with the funding that we have for web series, how bizarre it is that this actually rocketed to fame. But I think it just really spoke to an existing fan base. And Carmilla, just very briefly, is like a web series about sort of a queer vampire love story between two women, and it's actually branded content funded by by Kotex, so a tampon company. So basically writes itself. And I think when I was interviewing for the role, Steph Walkdean, the producer on the film and of Carmilla, is a massive fangirl and also like a walking encyclopedia in general. And so we were just talking about like how we might want to do this. And she's like, well, we were thinking of filming Klexicon. And I was like, is that a medication? And they're like, she's like, oh no, you don't know anything, do you? And I'm like, no. And we had a 4-hour conversation where she just shared the entire story of queer fandom. And I was like, this is incredible. Not only was it, I think what brought me to fandom as someone who's like has been on the outside was, my background is a lot in equity and inclusion and social justice. And I saw this incredible kind of transaction of social capital from fandom to actual capital in terms of raising money through this, through the LGBT Fans Deserve Better movement, and to really inciting almost lobbying and change. And I thought that was super inspiring. And the fact that it's done with like a bit of a wink and all these like cheesy jokes like is even better. So just for those who don't know, Klexicon is maybe I'm sure I'm talking to the choir here, but Klexicon is a convention that was started when a character named Lexa was brutally killed after consummating her relationship on the 100. But this came after there was this like, bloody spring of something like 22 lesbian characters in genre TV shows being murdered, particularly in brutal ways, and almost always after they consummated their relationship. And it was kind of like, enough is enough. And it's another manifestation of a trend or like a trope in television called the barrier gaze kind of trope, which is effectively that any queer character must meet their moral demise and is effectively a villain that needs to pay retribution for. So even if they have happiness, they need to be punished in a storyline. So that was a bit of a digression. But with Klexicon, what attracted me was exactly that, is that there's this power to the people narrative that was just, gorgeous. Like, who doesn't want to highlight that? But what I recognized is like, I really couldn't tell that story without starting from a point that explained some history. I knew I wasn't going to get all the history, and that really stressed me out because like I really didn't want to let down fans. But I needed to find tent poles in queer female fandom history, and it kind of mirrors sort of what you were outlining, Aphrodite, which was, we called it from subtext to main text to what's next. So the subtext, we briefly touched on Star Trek, but we really harped in on Xena because we do feel like there was an explosion there, not just for queer female fandom, but fandom in general. There was, this sort of intersection of multiple pop culture moments happening, not the least of which was the internet. And as we head into main text, we notice, okay, well, there's visibility, but it's fairly problematic and usually pretty atrocious. And there's like the angry lesbian, the upset lesbian, the angry upset lesbian, and like the grumpy lesbians, lots of drama, not a ton of like romance. And then the L word, of course, becomes this breakthrough of, not just queer women, but like lots of queer women, and some of them aren't dead, which is great. So we felt that by sharing some of this context, that those who are not in the know, like myself, and I imagined myself as an audience member, we were able to just say, like, why was this such a buildup? Like, why are people so invested in this representation? Because it's not just fandom, it's actually like the desperate need we all have as humans who are, in a Western privileged country, like the need to belong, the need to be visible, the need to exist. And television and media is a huge marker of whether we can understand who we are in the context of society.
I love that image that you gave us of tentpoles in queer fandom history, because there are so many sort of B plots, like plot Bs in different TV shows that you became obsessed with. Like, why was I watching All My Children for 2 minutes of screen time between the two characters, right? But we do have these sort of moments where like things sort of build up to something that kind of like that even outside of the sort of niche fandoms that people are somehow aware of, with Klexicon and the barrier gaze trope hitting the New York Times and more mainstream media, and people starting to realize, oh, if we keep killing off the lesbian on our show, we might get some backlash or something, So kind of thinking about, queer tropes, like which queers are, of course, very familiar with. We're very familiar with the character being killed off or going back to a man, or, all sorts of like things that happen to queer characters and specifically to lesbian characters. And I think there's also an interesting discussion, a whole conversation to be had about lesbian versus bisexual representation in television and film. And usually the bisexual gets to live. But the lesbian doesn't, right? Because the bisexual gets to continue having a storyline with relevant male characters. And
the bisexual tends to be either slutty or on drugs or
yes,
somewhat naughty in some way.
Right. So like there's more to be said about that. And it's hard for it to kind of cover every trope in the universe that queer viewers have seen in television and film. And, thinking about the kind of harm that was done with these, with these tropes and these storylines, writers and creators and production companies have caused all this harm, and the kind of fan reaction, Sheila, you brought this up earlier, fan fiction had a kind of healing power for people who wanted to envision a different ending. Or tell a story that they whether a different ending, whether that's Xena or any other show. So can for anyone who has reactions to this, can you comment on the role of fan fiction in creating community and building queer fandom then, and how do you think it might be similar or different than the role of fan fiction today?
Well, I can definitely say that I was a stalker of fan fiction websites as a young person. I missed the entire convention situation. I'm a little bit younger, so when I started to watch Xena, it wasn't until the mid 2000s, and at that point I wasn't really old enough to go to conventions, and so the way that I participated was just silently reading fan fiction by myself in my room constantly all night. So I will say that there's this kind of collective buy-in that happens with the creative license that everyone feels surrounding a fandom. It's definitely something that inspired me to want to write something in the realm of Xena. And I think it was really apparent, at least what I perceived as a young teen, it was really apparent that this was a very, like a sacred space, a sacred piece of material. The Xeniverse is shared by so many. And what I really appreciated was that we can disagree on some of the details to do with the show, and I feel like Xenites often do that. But there is this shared understanding of like the intense meaning of what the Xeniverse is, which I really appreciated about reading fan fiction then, and it made me feel part of the community, even though I wasn't able to actually participate in an in-person or even online chatting style community. So I'll say that about earlier fan fiction.
Other reactions to the role of fan fiction in queer fandom communities then versus now?
Yeah, another historical point. I mean, Xena did not invent fan fiction. The internet did not invent fan fiction. Fan fiction and queer fandom had existed beforehand. But before the internet, Star Trek fiction, that / Kirk Spock fiction, it existed, but it was distributed, circulated in sort of mimeographed copies at fan conventions. It didn't have a large audience. It had an audience, but not a large one. You had to be a really committed fan and be able to go to the spaces where you could actually physically get hold of this. And Xena fan fiction, first of all, it is so much more widely available through the World Wide Web. You can read it, and in countries where lesbian fiction is more or less illegal, you can still get hold of it. That's a very important point. And also it differed from the Kirk Spock / fiction. First of all, I don't want to tread on anybody's toes here, but there is no attempt by the makers of that original series to give any foothold for subtext in that series. So it was, so you basically, the fans had to queer it. It is queer, but it's queer in a very limited sense, because as we know, most of this / fiction, Kirk Spock / fiction, was written by straight women. And that was really where like queer fan fiction was before Xena. And so Xena is lesbians, not only lesbian, largely lesbians writing about lesbians and having this really wide audience. And it, at a time when the availability of lesbian fiction was in decline, because this was the age in which the big bookstores like Barnes and Noble, Borders, were driving out of business women's bookstores. And women's bookstores were the places where you could find lesbian fiction. And as they were disappearing, lesbian fiction was disappearing with them. So Xena fan fiction really, in many ways, saved lesbian fan fiction.
I got chills from that. Penny, you have a reaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. First of all, thank you, because I learned so much just from that I could walk into my first experiences with women being like, I got this, I have read volumes, I'm all over this, let's go. Not like, the classic, I have no idea what to do. And I'm not even joking about that. Like, seriously, for me, fan fiction was a way for me to be like, well, I think I'm gay, but I have no idea what I'm doing. I literally had read so much fanfic at that point where I was like, pretty sure I'm 100% gay and I know exactly what I'm doing, let's go. So thank you to all of those fanfic writers out there. And I also want to say, just in terms of like the difference between back then when we would download, like documents or whatever, however we read, I used to print mine out and then I could take it to bed because, we had to share our one computer that we had in the house. These days, I feel like not only are people still writing fan fiction and publishing on, like much larger communal websites, but we're taking it to a whole new level of almost like role play through like D&D. I know that there are some Xenites that do campaigns that are based in the world of Xena Warrior Princess. And I mean, I think that's really cool because we're not just, right, it's turned into this whole new thing of like interactive and queer and Xena. I'm seeing that a lot more as well. Thirsty Sword Lesbians, I think, is not specifically Xena, but it is like queer, you know, role play D&D. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
You know, we're talking a lot about sort of ways in which fans are interacting with each other through fiction, whether that's, you know, exchange of publications or reading things online. And Penny, you're an organizer of IRL, in real life, in-person queer community gatherings, right? With Spark Purple and with Xenite Retreat. You know, how do you feel? Can you tell us more about this, about your experience of organizing these events, and how you hope queers are connecting with each other in new ways today versus maybe in the past?
Yeah, of course. I really had no experience. I was a fan that went to Xena conventions, and when the conventions ended, I just wasn't ready for it to be done. I wanted, to me, that was where I, as a wide-eyed 21-year-old who had never really had an opportunity to like be in really big queer spaces other than just like the one queer nightclub in my town, I got to XenaCon and suddenly there were lesbians everywhere. And I mean, it was incredible to me. And it felt like this must be what it's like to not stand out and be different. Like no one is assuming. In fact, it's the other way around. Like you have to come out as straight at those places. Yes. And it's a shock sometimes when she's straight, what? Like it's, you know, it's really cool. And so I remember witnessing a dance between these two Amazon elders. They were, oh my gosh, they must have been at least in their 70s or 80s. And that was the moment where I was like, I can be queer and it'll be okay. Like I can have a happy ending as well. And I can live a life and, you know, tick off all those little boxes they shove down our throat to make sure that we get through. And so I didn't want that to be over. And when they said it was ending, I was like, okay, what are we doing? Let's do this. And I picked summer camp because as an Australian, we never really get that classic American cliche of summer camp. So we did. We found a local summer camp, and I put the word out, and I was like, I'm doing this Xena summer camp. Who wants to come along? And people decided to come along. But it was knowing that being in that space had such a profound impact on my ability to feel authentic and safe and just special. I had to keep that going. And I would go to XenaCon and just feel like a superhero. Like I was just me, and everything was great. And I remember having conversations of like, God, wouldn't it be great if real life was like this? Why can't I go back to my life in Australia and just feel this confident and this genuine and just be like full of energy and just raw? And I was like, well, why not? Like, let's have more of that. So yeah, over the past 7 years, we've been running this Xenite Retreat, which is really a place where, I mean, it is definitely a Xena warrior princess themed camp. That's very clear. It's woven all through the weekend. But this particular last year, just given that we've been waiting so long to get together since COVID put a pause on things, it really hit me of like, we need this. And there are people out there that aren't necessarily Xena fans, but that are queer, that deserve to have spaces like this. So that's really what made me want to, you know, keep it going and do more of it.
Gabrielle, did you
I think, yeah, I thought that was a pretty big shocker for me when I went down to Xena camp. This was like right at the beginning of production. So it was my fandom 101 experience, and Kim Taborn gave us like 3 hours to educate us. So like the beginnings of fandom. And but I was surprised because I would talk to some folks, campers there, and some folks were like, yeah, I've maybe seen like a couple of episodes from season 2. And I'm like, wait, you're at a camp, like literally dedicated to the show, and you haven't watched it. And it dawned on me then that it really was about community and family to a degree, and like finding like-minded folks. And that over time, like the actual like story or IP that may have like been the impetus for community was not necessarily as important as the result of what this show created. And I thought that really was a big aha moment for me around what to emphasize in the documentary is that aspect of community connection, not necessarily the show itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
A really special moment for me was this year. I was very lucky enough to spend a little bit of time with Renee O'Connor, who of course played Gabrielle in Xena, and she was just asking me how retreat was going, which in itself was absolutely crazy and cool. That like just amazing. And I just remember telling Renee how nervous I was for this year after having such a pause, and how excited I was to be back with everybody, and how we had the largest group of people coming from all over the world. And she looked at me and she said, you know, this is really special work you're doing. I'm really proud of you. And it was so full circle, because as Gabrielle, as the person that she was playing this role with Lucy Lawless, that was really special work. And that is what inspired us to get together and to be brave enough to be ourselves in a world back then when it like wasn't very cool. And so just having that little moment just was really cool to know that it's, I don't know, yeah, full circle.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, you know, when you're bringing together people who with such varied life experiences, people from around the world, people of all ages, people who you know, came into queerness or came into fandom and during different life stages, or people who maybe like racial minorities, other sort of gender nonconforming people who don't really see themselves on screen, and maybe they're entering this space. So can you share more? And Penny, this doesn't have to be a question just for you, but for anyone, about, you know, cultivating like inclusive, multi-generational queer fandom spaces, and navigating the sort of cultural difference and cultural exchange when you have all these people with varied life experience who all share this sort of same specific interests. You know, how can those kinds of spaces be built up?
Sheila, I'd love your opinion as a camper, and Aphrodite too. You were here as a camper. As an organizer, to me, it's just about having no preconceived notions of how we're going to plan, how things are going to go down. I mean, you really create the space, and then it is up to the individual people to show up and be their authentic selves. And what we've luckily seen is that everybody is so open and accepting. And I love the age differences are amazing, because we've got people who are in their 80s now who are doing high ropes and archery and all that stuff. It's just insane and amazing. But more importantly, are open to things like pronouns, and hey, my pronouns were different last year, but this year these are my pronouns. And for them to be like, okay, you know, like there's this wonderful, I don't want to say education, because that's not it, but it's just, I guess, openness of this is me. And yeah, we have had a couple of the elders who are like, oh, you know, I don't quite understand this, but okay, you know, and it's really actually really lovely to see, because they just go with it, and you don't often get that in the real world.
Yeah. Sheila, do you have thoughts on this?
I would just echo what Penny has said. I mean, Penny has created something absolutely amazing. None of us really knew what the Xenite retreat was going to be before we went there.
Neither did I, Sheila.
And I think, you know, what you said is that you just let what happen, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also have to echo what I was lucky enough to visit Xena Retreat this past April, and it was one of the most incredible experiences, I would say, of my life. So I agree, it was phenomenal, and the space itself is just something that you can't really experience anywhere else. So I also commend Penny for that. It's really, really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. One of the most humbling, touching conversations that I had was with a camper who said that they felt such gender euphoria at the Paint Yourself Blue and Hell at the Moon, that they do not take their shirt off in public, and that at this particular event, which is literally just, it's exactly what it sounds like. You paint yourself blue and you howl at the moon. That they felt so comfortable and at home in their own body, which is something that they hadn't felt before, that they just embraced it fully. And that was really I mean, this particular howl this year, I think just waiting so long to get together was particularly insane and outrageous in like the best way. But that was so special to hear that somebody who didn't feel like that for a very long time, all their life, they said, could come here and feel great. Yeah, special.
Yeah. I mean, I was a camper as well, and I was so impressed with how multi-generational, inclusive it was. I thought that if it was also quite multiracial, and I don't know why I would have expected otherwise. But it was very exciting to see all these different kinds of people come together over a shared love of something. And we're now like many years past when when Xena aired its last episode, and many fandoms outlived their original source material by many years, by decades, by generations. And in that time, queer fans get very creative, and they continue to produce new content. And Lucy, thinking about your adaptation of Xena for the stage with Xena Warrior Musical, which had its West Coast premiere at Xena at Xenite Retreat, it absolutely incredible. Can't wait to see this show actually like move forward and produce one day. Your show is a real, you're like Xena Warrior Musical is a tribute to the original series. So, how do you see your work as both an extension of an original universe, but also a new take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're too kind. I'm like blushing about it, but thank you very much for your words. I think that it's a difficult thing to do. Megan Rose is my co-writer, my co-creator, and we were trying to accomplish so much. Being a tribute show that really paid homage to exactly what the show was, including the tone, which is incredibly difficult to nail and was something that I was most concerned about going into an adaptation, bringing the TV series to the stage. That camp that we talked about, but that's always rooted and weighted down in a very, very strong heart, is difficult to find a balance for. So we were trying to do that and also bring in something new. It was the 25th anniversary. Originally in 2020, when it was supposed to premiere, it was going to be the 25th anniversary. So because of that, we knew we had to create a new character that was of a new generation. It was really moving the story forward. So we're balancing those things. We're balancing a new storyline that also is sure to be evocative of different parts of the TV series. So the whole thing is designed to be nostalgic. Like each scene is really based on a scene that is in the series, even though it's about a totally different storyline with different characters. So there's all these really, I mean, it was a lot of intricate work to try to make sure that it was honoring the source material and also creating something that didn't break the universe. That was really important to me, that we situate it in a place that didn't break any storylines and was able to add to the narrative. And also we focus a lot on restorative narratives. So the biggest difference, the biggest addition that I'm sure is obvious that we added is that the relationship between Xena and Gabrielle is more explicit, more physically explicit. And that was something that I felt like if we were going to do this adaptation, it was necessary to include that and explore that and make sure that that representation was part of the work. Yeah, so it was a big project to kind of balance all those things at once, and also create good musical theater, which is also important,
Yeah, and so much of what your show tried to accomplish was like the essence of specific characters through music, and deliver something that we hadn't seen before, with like actual vocals. And like I mean we've had musical episodes on the show, but we haven't had an entire show. And I think the word that I think that you might have used is like restorative, or like the sort of healing purpose of fan fiction, or the healing purpose of extending an existing universe and taking it in a new direction, making explicit the fact that Xena and Gabrielle had romantic feelings for each other and not platonic ones. And I remember when I watched the show at Xenite retreat, I just felt like a little tear just sort of like do this when they consummated their feelings for each other in the show. I was like, I just needed to see that. I needed to see that performed like on stage. So, you know, I have some more questions that we didn't quite get to, but I also know that we might have some questions from our audience, and I want to make sure we get to that. So one of our questions is, you know, with the increased commodification of conventions, the shift to mega companies like Disney running conventions rather than fans organizing them themselves, what do you see for the future of IRL in real life fandom spaces? And Penny, maybe you have some reactions to this question.
Oh yeah, maybe a couple of reactions to this question. For me, I feel like the more, I mean, sure, you're always going to get your big companies that are going to be able to throw a bunch of money to make really cool things. But if you want that, go to fucking Disneyland. You know, you can get your Pride Mickey Mouse ears at Disneyland these days as well. But if you want like authentic queer spaces where I mean, to me, that's what it's all about. It's like queer spaces run by queer people. That's the kind of thing that I'm showing up for. And I think that you can feel the difference as a child of conventions, or I say child. I kind of like came into, I started out as a younger person at conventions and sort of grew up along the way. And the difference from going from a corporately run convention to like a fan event. And I've never been to Clexa, but I've seen the same thing there. Some of the Winona Earp gatherings as well. There's just something different when it's run by the people who are actually walking the walk as well as talking the talk. It's just different. And so, yeah, honestly, that's why I'm doing the terrifying thing of rebranding my company and launching into a larger space of queer events and putting on different events. Like, there are so many D&D conventions out there. We're gonna be running a queer D&D weekend retreat. Like it's just so different. And I think that I guess that's really the like we're different, you know, like it's just not the same, which is not, you know, groundbreaking to say. I'm not offering any like revelations or anything, but really it's just, I think you can just feel, it's just a vibe.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, so like as fans, what we want is human connection, right? We want to feel like, and that's what the whole point of storytelling, right? The whole point of fiction, the whole point of like is to access the part of you that feels human. And, you know, when you go to an event or when you meet other fans, it kind of like when you feel truly seen in some way, that's when the magic happens. And I think maybe, you know, especially with the sort of mainstreaming of San Diego Comic-Con becoming really unaffordable, inaccessible, you know, tickets are gone like that. You know, how can you access these spaces when it's becoming very expensive to do so? And many people can't access it. And even when they do go, they feel like they're, like their sheep or their cows being herded into like a large room, waiting in line in the San Diego heat for hours and hours, like only to be turned away at the door, you know, and is there another path? Like, is there another way for fans to be convening where they're not, you know, being, when their bank accounts are not being drained and when they're not being kind of exploited for profit? I mean, of course, fans do this, they go to conventions because it's fun, but it takes something away from it as well to be going to that. Yeah.
I think a lot of it is about just not squeezing the fans dry for every single last drop and dollar. Like, we know that photos don't cost as much as they're charging, but I'll tell you, I paid a lot of money for my loose flawless photo op because I bloody wanted it, you know? And if a fan wants something and if somebody knows that they will pay it, they will pay whatever they'll charge it. I remember a moment at the silent auction that we did at Xenite Retreat, where this one I was in a bidding war with somebody, and she said to me, I know it's slightly problematic, I was bidding on something, but it's all good. And she said to me, I'm going to pay whatever it takes for this. And I was like, honey, don't tell me that, you know? And I stepped away because I was like, you clearly really want it. That's like, go for it. You can have it. But people know that fans will pay whatever. And it's just insane to me that it's okay. And we kind of feed it because we pay whatever we do. We let them treat us that way. So for me, I think one of the differences with Spark Purple as well, at the Xenite Retreat, we have a scholarship. So yes, I mean, events cost money to put on, and I want to make sure that we're putting on the best possible event ever. And with, you know, rising costs and whatnot, like, we have bills to pay too, but we're not gonna like poke you until all the money comes out. It's like, this isn't what it costs to put on an event. This is what we need to do. And you know, the fans also will chip in. They understand there are people within the communities that can't afford to pay that because they're not all in the same space that we're in. And so we have people donating, whether it's purchasing full scholarships, or just some people are like, I have $20, I can donate that, and it all adds up. And so we're able to give, I think we've given over 30 scholarships throughout the year for the 5 retreats that we've done to campers, which is really cool, and something that I want to continue with the other retreats we do.
Yeah.
It all just comes back to community again, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Meg and I feel the same way, actually, just about the Xena musical. I mean, we are a not-for-profit project. Everything we do is like, I wanted to do this just because I felt I wanted to pay back the fandom, pay back the show for how much I really held on to it as a true north growing up. And so that is exactly what this is. It is a gift that I hope other fans enjoy as much as I enjoyed making it. And so for that reason, yeah, we are not looking to do anything except get as many people to be able to see it as want to see it.
Yeah. And it's, so some of it is like, not just like, kind of, instead of turning to the sort of the creators or the corporations that are behind the, like, behind the source material, the fans, the artists, the creators, the people who are, you know, selling their fan art, you know, the people who are making music. By the way, Xena Warrior Musical, you can buy the full album. It's terrific. And on Bandcamp, definitely give that a look-see. But, you know, and even in the way that fans are able to kind of purchase from each other and benefit each other, and kind of build that kind of economy, instead of maybe the one that we're sort of served in a more mainstream capacity. Yeah. The true spirit, yes. Are there any, we have a couple more questions. Let's see. Okay, here we go. In the past few years, this is a question from Lee, many members of Women Who Love Women fandom spaces that are on the younger side have had more examples of explicit queer representation on screen, and thus are having very different expectations for what kind of queer content is valuable to engage in than folks who grew up in a landscape of queer TV that mostly had to live in subtext and queer coding because of censors. What are your thoughts and messages to young fans who may discount shows like Xena without watching it because they've seen some people write it off as queer baiting? Gabrielle, I see your hand is up.
I think this is what I found really interesting is when this came up a lot with querying the script. And I think it really mirrors the general intergenerational, sometimes tension that you find in the queer community at large, which is sometimes working with, I wouldn't even say older, like literally between, you know, a lot of my work, I work with maybe Gen Zers, and I'm on the older cusp of millennials, so are some of the folks I work with. And even just that tension really plays out of like, what are our expectations of what is great representation? What are our expectations of how queerness is handled and taken up in storytelling? But also just like like the values shift is just so different. And I remember we were interviewing a few fans at Lexicon who had these, you know, really deep critiques of the L word. And I kind of just asked a few questions just to clarify. And they're like, well, I haven't actually watched it. Like, I've just seen clips. And so I think that what you're dealing with is two things. I noticed that fans do have a tendency, observational, this is an anecdotal observation, do have a tendency towards a respect for canon and a respect for like investigating sort of the roots to a particular community or cause. And I think as natural sort of folks who are maybe more engaged in literature or engaged in going deep intellectually, there's many folks that I spoke to who are in that sort of queer fandom, younger age, have all of the representation, sort of the intersectional representation in front of them, that can appreciate, you know, this is what paved the way. And also like the fun of being part of doing the storytelling. Like I think there was a fun in having subtext because it created a whole community that decided what that subtext was. Which is gone when it's explicit, I think. And then there's those who just like really don't get it and don't necessarily see it as something to pay homage to. And in many cases, I found that these were folks who at large are, you know, they might have intersectional experiences that were never represented in these previous like sort of subtext driven shows. Don't feel adequately represented in shows that have explicit queerness. And I think are just like more skeptical of having this romantic idea of these stories when they're like, well, it's still not nearly representative of my experience. And I, you know, and it's kind of a stance. But I did pick up on them. And I did find it interesting that it mirrored tensions that I noticed in the community at large.
It's definitely not queer baiting, right? It's absolutely it was not queer baiting. It was groundbreaking. And I think that not everybody's going to relate to everything. And if you write off a show just because you can't, like you can't see yourself in it, or you can't relate to it in a certain specific way, or you can't get something out of it that you're specifically looking for, then you can go off and get that from other shows, but don't discount Xena, because you're missing out on not just the show and, you know, all the, I mean, it's funny, even it still stands up. The graphics are terrible, but the show, the stories, it's still worth watching if you're looking for a giggle, if you're looking for a beautiful friendship or romance between two women. Like, you can read into that what you want, and you don't need it to be explicit for it to be beautiful. We can just be grateful for how it exists, just for exactly what it is. I don't know, I'm certainly not putting that delicately, but the relationship between those two characters is so beautiful that it doesn't need to be explicit, it doesn't need to be labeled if you don't want it to. And if you don't give it a chance, you're missing out on the most incredible fandom. So
I also just think it was almost an asset that there was no explicit relationship between them, because it allowed the relationship to develop so much more deeply over that long period of time throughout the seasons, that really, I feel like that was even more special. I think we also don't see a lot of intimate friendships on television or in film, which is very important. And yeah, it's why the word love is not in Xena and Gabrielle's love duet, because it's so much bigger than that, right? And I don't think that would have been an understanding of mine of their relationship had it been explicit in the series.
And I think about, you know, I'm here as Asami Sato from Legend of Korra, and, you know, like younger fans who didn't watch like Legend of Korra, you know, they watch a show like She-Ra, Princesses of Power, they say Steven Universe, where you have the characters actually kiss, and you see that on the screen, and they think, well, why didn't Legend of Korra do that, right? And like there are all sorts of reasons why, including censorship from Nickelodeon, but that doesn't mean, you know, there's that meme on Tumblr that says Legend of Korra crawled so that Steven Universe could walk, so that She-Ra, Princess of Power could run, right? That all these things something had to precede something, right? You know, if you think about Ellen, and she, you know, she comes out on her TV show, they didn't show her sleeping with people, they didn't show her kissing anyone, she just said she was gay. But because she did that, there was, you know, like other shows, other kind of works of fiction could show more. And so all of this is kind of in this sort of slow roll towards visibility and representation.
Yes, Ellen got cancelled because she came out. Jojo Siwa is being freaking celebrated because she came out, and it's incredible that she could be so brave to jump online and come out and be celebrated when and that's the same thing. Ellen crawled so that everybody else could fly.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. So just in the last minute or two, you know, I want to hear from folks here about your current or future projects that you'd like for our audience to know about, ways in which we could support you, or if there's even outside of Xena, if there is like a specific queer fandom that we haven't talked about tonight that you are like, listen, can I recruit you? You can share that here. So maybe Lucy, why don't you tell us about your current projects?
Sure. So Megan Rose and I are working on a new musical. It's a piece about Atalanta, who was a Grecian hero of mythology, raised by a bear in the woods. I highly recommend that you look up Atalanta. I feel like oftentimes she's left out of every mythology book that I pick up. It's very interesting, but a really great character and lots to explore with gender and society and all kinds of things. So that's what we're working on right now, and really can't wait to get it out there.
Fabulous, thank you.
Yeah.
Gabrielle, what are you up to?
Well, a couple of things. So I've been, I just released a new kind of short form competition series with the voguing ballroom community here in Canada. It's called A Canadian Ballroom Extravaganza, and that was super fun. Unfortunately, I don't know how much of it is visible, like the finale is not visible to the States, but here's the website to check it out. Effectively, it was like it was a hybrid like ballroom competition. And by that, I mean sort of underground houses burning Vogue ballroom, not like people dancing in chapels and stuff. And it was a hybrid that with a short film competition. So you get to vote on the films that you like the most. So that's online, but the competition is now closed and we had the finale. And I actually wanted to say there was querying the script. We had some issues. The production company was, I guess, deciding around the distribution and rights in the US. And it's not very visible from the US. So I shared this with Lucy here. I wanted to drop in the chat access to a free screener with a password. So that everyone here can see it if they'd like to, since a lot of the stuff that we talked about today is in the film, and it would be my pleasure to share that with the amazing community, some of whom I see have been in the documentary. I'd love you to be able to see this work and tell me all about it, rate it on IMDb if you'd like. And that would be my thank you.
Where can we access this?
I'm about to drop it in the chat.
So
ultimately, we have distribution in other parts of the world, but for some reason, the production company behind this was encountering tough decisions, I suppose, with playing in the US, which is arguably the only place I really care about it playing. So I will give you this screener link for free.
Wow, what a gift. Thank you so much. That's very, very generous of you as a creator and filmmaker to share this with you. By the way, it is 1000% worth the viewing. If you are like a queer fangirl out there, you're going to see yourself in this film. Yeah, we've got another question. Is there anywhere other than HIG where folks can listen to a demo from Atalanta, the long shot?
Oh, yes, Lee. So Meg and I were on Lee's podcast, History is Gay. It's amazing. Everybody go listen to it. That was a question just for me, I think.
Oh, sorry.
But it's okay. No, but there will be samples out. If you go to lucierrose.com, there's a page there for Atalanta, and we'll be putting some things up there pretty soon. Thanks, Lee, though. Okay.
Thank you. Please put the link in the chat there.
Sure.
And then we did get one more question from a fan, from Brian Ago 23. Could the dream of Xena having a different ending still come true by fans' impact? Might be wishful thinking, but who knows? Just imagine the impact it could do, especially with everything going on. And maybe I'll broaden this a little bit more, but if you have a wish for the future of queer fandom or the future of specific, the future of Xena, what might that wish be? And then we'll keep that brief, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Can I just say that I think it did, the fans' impact. I think that Xena Warrior Musical gave the fans another ending, an incredible ending. So I just check it out, XenaWarriorMusical.com for sure.
Yeah. Any other final wishes for the future of queer fandom?
Oh my gosh, that's a very, very large question.
Yeah.
Yes. With 1 minute left. Let's
my wish maybe is for more of the characters who are side characters, the sort of best friend, or the best friend, or the person in the friend group who is always cracking the best joke, always the stealing stones, the scene, the characters who are disabled, who are fat, who are not the protagonist of the series. What my wish is for them to get their own stories, and for them to get their own sort of fandoms, so that more of the fans who maybe aren't feeling seen right now get to have and share in that experience. Yeah.
Great.
I want all these characters who are getting the plot B, I want them to get the plot A. That's what I like to see.
Heck yeah.
All right. Thank you everyone for attending today's virtual panel. It was such a pleasure to be moderating this conversation with 4 spectacular guests who offered some really thoughtful, intelligent comments this evening. And thank you again to the American LGBTQ+ Museum. And I'm Aphrodite, and I hope you'll check out all the links that we put in the chat for you, and support the folks here in this room. All right.